that now prevails around meeting our national climate change commitments. So, moving forward to moderate today's discussion, we have two very dear people, two special Gaia subcommittee members who've been helping me on this journey. Firstly, we have Ms. Sasha Jatansingh. She is a Commonwealth Climate Finance Advisor to Antigua and Barbuda. And then secondly, we have Ms. Babita Dubé, the founder of My Beach, My Water, also a chemical engineer by background with 20 years of experience in the oil and gas sector. Now, before we move forward, and before I hand you over to Sasha and Babita, I want us first to go through some of the ground rules. So the first is, please keep your mics muted to eliminate any background noise. Keep your questions to the Q&A, but feel free to type them in the chat box if any do come to mind before we get to the Q&A session. Alternatively, when we are in the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and unmute your mic and ask a question. And then finally, let's remember to respect each other and keep an open mind to the discussion. And with that, I want to hand you over to Sasha and Babita.
Thanks so much, Susan, and welcome everybody to this SBTT Gaia Subcommittee Technical Talk. And I think this talk is actually quite relevant since it's about sustainability in the energy sector of Trinidad and Tobago, and noting that, you know, one of the biggest international climate change conferences is happening in a few weeks, and we have the two climate change negotiators for Trinidad and Tobago here with us. So I'm very excited for that. And they're actually my former boss and my former colleague. So I think it's quite pertinent to have them here to really share their knowledge and expectations for COP26, as well as the energy transition in Trinidad and Tobago today. And remember that this is an interactive talk, so definitely, you know, feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat, and we will have a question and answer session at the end. So the two speakers. So Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh has the lead climate change negotiator for Trinidad and Tobago for many years. He's currently the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development, and is the overall lead on coordinating climate action and international reporting on various multilateral environmental agreements. He has also held various leadership positions internationally, such as he was the chair of the Subsidiary Body on Scientific and Technological Advice to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and he was also the co-chair of the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Durban Platform, which was the body charged with negotiating the Paris Agreement in 2013 and 2014. And also, the other speaker we have today is Ms. Cindy Singh, and she is the climate change specialist in the Multilateral Environmental Agreements unit at the Ministry of Planning and Development. And she holds a Master's of Science from York University in Environmental Studies. And she's currently the coordinator for adaptation for the Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS. And she attends the negotiations under the UNFCCC for Trinidad and Tobago. And currently, Cindy supports projects and activities which seek to effect the national climate change policy, as well as implementation of our nationally determined NDC, nationally determined commitments. I think I'm saying that wrong. It's a long day for Trinidad and Tobago, which is basically our climate targets under the Paris Agreement. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Kishan and Cindy to share their thoughts and expectations for COP26 and the priorities for the energy transition for Trinidad and Tobago. So welcome, Kishan and Cindy. What I'll do now is actually start sharing the presentation. So you could just tell me when to slides. What is coming up right now?
Okay, thank you, Sasha. You need to put it on slideshow.
Sure. Let me just see. Slideshow. One. And okay, I am sorry, but I'm having some issues with Teams. I don't know if Suzanne or Babita could support on this.
Sure, let me check. I think you need to stop sharing. Did you stop sharing?
Yeah, I did.
All right. Just give me a minute, please. Are you seeing the slides now?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Suzanne and Sasha. First of all, good afternoon. It's still afternoon, yes. And welcome, and thank you for joining after hours at this late, after a hard day's work, for a presentation on what is not the most exciting issue in the world, unfortunately, but critically important. And as Sasha had introduced the talk this evening, and I have limited time, so I'll try as much as possible to compress all of the relevant information into 30 minutes. The slides are long in terms of the number of slides, but I don't have any intention of going through each and every slide. It is just there for completeness, which can be shared for reference later on, should you have the desire to look back and have a second read of what was presented. So the outline of next slide, sorry, the outline of the presentation basically looks at what at the issue of climate change, and I will go through some of the things. Can you change the slide, please, Susan, if you at the controls? Great. So at the core of the issue that needs to be addressed is that of global warming and climate change, largely due to emissions of what are called greenhouse gases. Well, I'm speaking to engineers, so you should know this. I wouldn't get too simple. I'll keep it relatively technical. Of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are heat trapping because they absorb that part of the infrared spectrum that causes warming. Largely as a result of the combustion of fossil fuels for energy. And that has been so since the Industrial Revolution of the mid-1800s. And as a result, the climate, or the atmosphere rather, has warmed because of the increased emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And with increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you have increasing heat trapping potential and capacity. And with that, heat trapping potential and capacity comes with it increasing temperatures. And that has caused the global atmosphere to warm over the past several decades, or since 1870 actually, at a rate that has been unprecedented over the past 800,000 years or so. And yes, you heard correct, 800,000 years, proxied by looking at Vostok ice cores and looking at the composition of the Earth's atmosphere at that time. And therefore, because the temperature of the atmosphere rises, the increased energy in the atmosphere is dissipated through the climate system. And therefore, the terms global warming and climate change are used interchangeably. This was seen as a problem because we are experiencing already changes in the climate for quite some time. And world governments have recognized that this is an issue and that there was a need to come together to agree on an approach to address the issue and basically cooperate through relevant instruments, internationally agreed instruments called sometimes conventions or protocols or multilateral environmental agreements to address the issue based on what each country can do. And so the international policy response to climate change has manifested itself into three legal instruments: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, which is not mentioned here because that has sort of phased out, and the Paris Agreement, which is now the focus of attention of world governments. And the core, the outline of the presentation will therefore look at what these instruments are, what Trinidad and Tobago's contribution or commitment is, what is expected at COP26 and why, and why the energy transition or the need for an energy transition is critically important for the world, and what COP26 may expect out of it based on some of the scientific evidence. And in order to minimize the social and the socioeconomic fallouts of an energy transition to low carbon development or low energy or low emissions energy sources, the Paris Agreement also provides for something called a just transition of the workforce, meaning that the labor force that has been or that are employed in carbon intensive industries, when that transition starts, that there should be opportunities for decent work going forward so that no one is left behind. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically COP26, what is COP26? The Conference of the Parties. It's called the Conference of the Parties, not to be confused with any of the political parties that exist in Trinidad and Tobago. It's the Conference of the Parties, which is an assembly of world governments, all the governments that are ratified parties to the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Convention. They come together and they make decisions, and the COP, therefore, is the supreme decision-making bodies of these legal instruments. And at COP26, there are issues that need to be addressed in light of very damning scientific evidence that came to light in August of this year, a few weeks ago, in the form of a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has revealed that the Earth is warming faster than ever at any point in its history, or recorded history, or proxied history, that the climate is changing at an unprecedented rate and may reach tipping points where it cannot be modeled. And as a result, there is a need to reduce emissions rather urgently in the next decade or two. In fact, the Paris Agreement has as its objective the constraining of temperature increases to be well below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, compared to pre-industrial levels or pre-1850 levels. The IPCC report basically says then that at the current rate of emissions and the current rate of warming, we will achieve 1.5 degrees by 2030, which is the next 7 years, which would be in our lifetime, next 8 years, which would be in our lifetime. At 1.5 degrees, the impacts would be huge. Coral reefs, for example, in islands such as Tobago, are expected to be totally killed by between 70 to 90% at a 1.5 degree warming. And at a 2 degree warming, by 99% estimate is the projected figure of decimation. And at projected warming, we are on stream for a 3 to 4 degree rise by 2100. That means we're in a world that may not necessarily be survivable for human beings, certainly for other species and coral reefs, I would imagine. So imagine a world in which we marvel at dinosaurs. We live in a world now with this projected warming, that we can be showing our grandchildren pictures of coral reefs and say, yes, these animals actually existed at some point in our lifetime and we were there. And the unfortunate moral to the story is that we were also responsible for their demise. But anyway, that's a moral discussion that we would probably not have at this point. So at COP26, governments are expected to come together to now deal with what has largely evolved to mean the climate emergency. Next slide, please. So the ultimate objective of the convention, the United Nations Framework Convention, is to stabilize greenhouse gases concentration at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic or human-induced interference with the climate system. And that level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally and to ensure food production is not threatened and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. That is typical UNEs. It does not specify what the level should be. It does not specify what the time frame should be. It does not specify what dangerous anthropogenic interference is. But the Paris Agreement basically now elaborates in more concrete terms and more defined terms what these levels should be and what time frames they should be achieved in. The climate has changed many times before, but very slowly, and that has allowed systems to adapt. The real concern here now is the rate at which it's happening that is not giving natural and human systems time to adapt to it properly. Next slide, please. So the objectives of the Paris Agreement in a further elaboration of the objective of the Climate Change Convention from which the Paris Agreement is derived is to hold increase in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius with efforts to achieve a further increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and also to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and to foster low greenhouse gas development and climate resilience in a manner that does not threaten food production, and to also, because all of this will require finance, there's a commitment by developed countries to provide finance. This is the financial flows now are to be consistent with greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So it means that what this ostensibly means is that in international investments, loans, grants, concessions by multilateral development banks, for example, or donor agencies, will now have to lend or provide financial flows that would have to meet these objectives or be consistent with these objectives. Next slide, please. So what the Paris Agreement also has as its objective is that the globe or the world should reach a peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and decrease rapidly after that, so that in the second half of this century, we should achieve a world of carbon neutrality. That means emissions should be balanced by sequestration, either through technology or through forestry or conservation of plants and so on, because of photosynthesis, they take in carbon dioxide, as you well know. So the objective is really to reach climate neutrality or carbon neutrality at the end of the century. As it stands, the emission, the pledges by governments, there's a gap that now requires an additional 40 to 45% of emissions to be reduced by 2030. And that is, again, in the reflection of the climate emergency. Next slide, please. And because of the cooperative nature of the Paris Agreement, every country in the world, from the most advanced developed country to the least developed island state, is obligated now to contribute what it can to reduce emissions, so that collectively the goal of the Paris Agreement and its objective can be achieved. And that is to be done through what Sasha had some problems pronouncing or mentioning, which I also have some problems as well, and I have to remind myself every so often. They are called nationally determined contributions. I prefer to speak in acronyms, so I'll say NDCs. And by its very name, it says nationally determined, which means that countries now have to determine what it can do within its national circumstances, its capacity, its human resource, financial capability, and so on, to contribute. And the Paris Agreement now also stipulates that NDCs are to be submitted every 5 years, and with each successive NDC of each successive 5-year period, a submission of NDC must be more ambitious than its immediate past NDC. So if we say we're doing we're going to reduce by 5 units by 2025. In 2025, when we submit another NDC, we cannot keep it at 5. We must go above, nor can we go below. So it's incrementally ambitious going forward. And that is the modality, that's the engine room of how countries are to contribute to achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Trinidad and Tobago, therefore, in keeping with the objectives and the obligations under the Paris Agreement, submitted its own NDC in 2015 and pledges to reduce overall cumulative emissions in 3 sectors, the power generation, transportation, and industrial sectors by 15% relative to a business as usual baseline that is equivalent to 103 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that is called a conditional target because there's recognition that finance would be required and finance would be expected to be provided by international community. But we have also submitted an unconditional target in the public transportation sector to reduce emissions by 30%, cumulative emissions, or 1.7 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent compared to 2013 by 2030. And the estimated cost is 2 billion, yes, not 2 million, $2 billion US. And hopefully that will be met through a mixture of domestic funding, international financing, including through funding from the newly established, well, not newly established, but the now central financing fund, which is called the Green Climate Fund. Next slide, please. So I've said in my opening statements of why COP26 is critically important because of the scientific evidence before us through the report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and therefore the urgency to now cut emissions rapidly and to reach net zero by 2050. How that can be achieved will be a big talking point at COP26 because it will require transformation of financial systems. It will require transformation of energy systems. It will require innovation, increased human capacity and technology because technology plays a great part in reducing emissions. And all of this will therefore translate into greater ambition across the board, whether it's a greater ambition to cut emissions, whether it's greater ambition to provide finance, whether it's greater ambition to increase capacity or technology development. COP26 is tagged as the Ambition COP. Next slide, please. Finance is also critically needed. Sorry about that. Finance is also critically needed, and developed countries pledged to raise international financing for developing countries to 100 billion by 2020, a target that was set in 2010. Actually, was formalized in 2010. It was initially touted in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference, but that has not been met. And at COP26, negotiations will begin to actually negotiate a new climate goal, a new finance goal for climate finance by 2025, using the 100 billion as a floor and not as a ceiling, because it is estimated that developing countries will require in excess of $3 trillion at a minimum to implement commitments under the Paris Agreement. And UNEP has estimated that that annual adaptation costs for developing countries are in the range of $70 billion US, but this will continue to rise as a result of the increasing rate of climate change and global warming. And also associated with that, and Cindy could tap on it a little bit more, is the issue of loss and damage, which means that it is not expected that you can adapt 100% to impacts of climate change. So, for example, sea level rise, which is a slow onset event, even though the rate at which it's happening has been increasing. Once sea level rises to erode a beach, for example, that is lost, virtually lost until temperatures go down and sea level is reversed, which will not be in our lifetime. So there would be some permanent loss and permanent damage to amenities including natural and biophysical systems and socioeconomic systems. And therefore, the costs of adaptation going forward will also be increasing. Next slide, please. So climate finance is one issue, and you could read that later on. Next slide. The Paris Agreement was not adopted on its own. It was adopted with an accompanying COP decision called 1CP21, which outlines some of the approaches to operationalizing the Paris Agreement and the provisions of the Paris Agreement. And a process was set in place on adoption of the Paris Agreement and the COP decision for parties or countries to negotiate how rules and modalities and procedures and processes and so on, guidelines on how various provisions of the Paris Agreement are to be implemented. But parties couldn't agree on all of these, and therefore there remain 3 outstanding issues for COP26, which is market mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which allows for trading of emissions credit, which is really an emissions trading mechanism. And I wouldn't get into Article 6. Common timeframes for commitments. How often should parties submit their commitments, and transparency and reporting. This last one is critical issue, because countries will now be asked to account, again, from the most developed rich country to the least developed poor country. If every country will now be held accountable in open forum through an expert review process, and be questioned and be asked to account for why it has not achieved its commitment or its NDC. And that is part of the transparency framework, and the details still are outstanding. Next slide, please. So we have already seen, for example, major shifts in the energy, in the global energy framework. And that has occurred largely because business itself, big business at COP21 recognized the need to do something about climate change, because they recognize that climate change will impact on their businesses and the viability of the businesses and their shareholders. And so they supported an ambitious agreement. But more recently, we have seen, for example, even oil companies have started to become aligned, and with increasing demands on environmental, social, and governance reporting, so-called ESG reporting. That is now becoming a benchmark for investment into companies. So Standard & Poor's, for example, has an S&P 500 ESG, and if you make it there, you're supposed to be a very good company. So the recognition of good business in terms of environmental, social, and governance issues is becoming critically important, not only to businesses themselves, but also to their shareholders and their investors. And we've seen the issues quite recently in the last few months that in terms of what happened to ExxonMobil and their board, largely pushed by shareholders and investors. Same thing with Shell. Shell was taken to court. They lost based on not doing enough to address climate change, and so on. So we are seeing that it's not only coming from the companies themselves recognizing the need to now adapt to the shift, but also from investors and shareholders demanding a change going forward. And this is likely to perhaps become the norm going forward. Next slide, please. And those were the results. We know that BP now is beyond petroleum, and BP with Shell is now among the largest investors in renewable energy. And as you would know, they have been given the contract in Trinidad and Tobago to construct a 112 megawatt solar farm. Is hopefully, I think, starting next year. I think that what the Minister of Finance said in his budget speech yesterday. So a lot of investment is now being shifted from oil exploration, and I think BP also mentioned that they will not be putting new investments into oil exploration in areas where they were not before. So we are seeing that shift going forward as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are now seeing that in that energy transition that is now inevitable, if we are to maintain livable conditions on Earth for human beings, that transition now has to take into consideration issues that were not necessarily defined before. But remember, the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 in December. That was 3 months after the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September of 2015. So the Sustainable Development Goals played a major part in influencing the architecture of the Paris Agreement, largely in the preambular paragraphs. And so now the preambular paragraphs of the Paris Agreement, while not legally binding, really sets the interpretative context to the operational paragraphs. And there is one in particular that speaks to that to parties need to take into consideration in implementing the Paris Agreement promote and respect for human rights, for the rights of indigenous peoples, for example, for vulnerable, those that are vulnerable in society, women, children, of gender equity, of decent work for all of these, reflections of the SDGs. And so part of that transition now necessitates the implementation of a just transition, making sure that ample opportunities are given to the existing labor force for retooling, for reskilling, for relearning, to adapt to the new technologies that will come on board in the future. We've already seen yesterday in the budget, for example, taxes being removed from electric vehicles. So that will come, that will bring with it, and that will come to the fore, requiring new technologies, new mechanics, new support and maintenance people. So that is a whole new area of green jobs that can be created, and that is also true of other green technologies. And we've seen where multilateral donors, multilateral banks, development banks have now greened their portfolio. The World Bank, for example, the European Development Bank, for example, are now phasing, not phasing out, but they're phasing in more stricter stipulations and conditions for concessional loans and grants and so on. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Right, so this is what is required for the energy transition, net zero by 2050, as I touched on earlier. And this is the projection in terms of global energy-related CO2 emissions in the net zero pathway and low international cooperation case going forward. It shows where at present we are and what is required going into the future for these emissions to be reduced. Next target, next slide, please. I'm reading the chat at the same time. So therefore, this the International Energy Agency in its report not too long ago basically outlined a few scenarios for net zero emissions by 2050. I wouldn't go through all of them, but it basically looks at how the different sectors that are responsible for emissions are to change going forward to 2050, or would need to be changed going forward. And there are various scenarios that that outline what needs to be done. Next slide, please. This is for completeness, not for discussion in depth. Next slide. So at COP26, it is expected that countries will have to deliver more ambition to keep the world on track, because we have to be thy brother's keeper. We cannot say, for example, but our emissions are very small and therefore we don't need to do anything. That is not an equity position to take, and the Paris Agreement recognizes that. As I said, from the largest emitter to the smallest emitter, they both are expected to contribute to the effort. And Trinidad and Tobago's policy framework, as I said, I gave you the NDC, what we are committed to. We are now setting the legal, policy, institutional, and administrative enabling environment to allow for the actions to be taken pursuant to our development of an NDC implementation plan, an NDC financial investment plan, and Sasha could chip in whenever she wants during the discussion, because she had led the development of that during that time. And we also developed, in keeping with that transition, we have developed a just transition policy, a draft just transition policy that is to be finalized, and Cindy will come in after and speak to that. Next slide, please. I wouldn't go through all of these initiatives; they are long, but let's skip these. These are the Trinidad and Tobago initiatives. You have climate change policy, a reduction strategy, implementation plan, and so on. We can elaborate on that if there's a need to. Next slide. The NDC implementation plan contains recommendations for strengthening institutional capacity, developing a climate finance plan, which we have done, mainstreaming climate change issues into the existing policy and legislative framework, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. The implementation plan can be provided. You can have a read of it. This disaggregates the cumulative emissions into the 3 sectors that are being targeted with the associated estimated reductions and the corresponding costs. And the bullet points there basically speak to some of the actions that in the sectoral plans that have been outlined in the implementation plan. Next slide, please. And that is the investment plan. We have a financial investment plan which outlines how investments can be aligned to NDC implementation and of course the Paris Agreement options, and also considers various approaches for financing climate action, including public and private partnerships. Next slide. We have developed a national monitoring, reporting, and verification system because we now need to account for our NDCs. We have to track the NDCs by virtue of emissions, and therefore the MRV system has been developed that will allow emitting entities, once you are involved in an activity that emits greenhouse gases, you would be required to submit your greenhouse gas inventory. It is being held, well, being hosted rather by the Environmental Management Authority. And we are now expanding that MRV system to include the new transparency framework of the Paris Agreement to also account for our emissions. So this has been pilot tested with industry, with some private sector, with some ministries, and it has been tweaked. The next step is expected to be that this will be incorporated into the legal framework to allow for mandatory reporting. And therefore we would be able to track our NDCs, but not only for international reporting purposes, but primarily for tracking the efficacy of our national climate change policy and the stated objective of low carbon development therein. Thank you. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you is not for you. Sorry. Okay, so these are this slide outlines some of the major players involved in the MRV system, which is the ministry with responsible for environment, EMA, and so on and so forth. You can read that at your leisure. Next slide, please. So the next steps really is to basically operationalize the MRV system fully nationwide, and to aid in the competencies of those emitting entities that will be providing data to the MRV system. We have developed a greenhouse gas certification program that allows certification that it should be rolled out by, I think, the UWI very soon. That would basically provide a certain minimum level of competency in doing greenhouse gas inventorying, because the law as proposed will require some level of competency in doing these inventories, much like under the air pollution rules of the EMA now, that requires a certain level of competency in doing air pollution monitoring and inventorying as well. Next slide. And as I said, we are expanding the MRV to incorporate the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, and this is already started through a grant from the Global Environment Facility and UNEP, whereby we will now incorporate other aspects of transparency reporting, including issues related to adaptation, and that is already underway. Next slide. Okay, this basically is some of the reporting requirements and obligations under the convention, which is our national communication and the biennial update report, which largely gives an account of what the country is doing to implement the convention, and as well an updated greenhouse gas inventory by sectors. Next slide. And this shows the trend from 2006 to 2008 in terms of levels of greenhouse gases disaggregated into carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Next slide. Okay, so electric vehicles, you heard about it in the budget yesterday. So there's now going to be a shift towards a greater penetration of electric vehicles into the transportation mix. And we have already started to create the enabling environment for that, including through a Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards standard for electric charging stations that can be installed at your home. So you can buy an electric vehicle and plug it in through one of these stations in your house and charge. And also the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, in collaboration with the Ministry of Planning and Development and the United Arab Emirates, is seeking to install solar chargers at the Queen's Park Savannah, fast chargers for electric vehicles. And therefore, now that this incentive has been provided through the budget, the relevant infrastructure now needs to be developed going forward. Next slide. I spoke about the renewable energy project. We also, in collaboration with the EU, would be setting up a Piaco Airport solar park and 12 community installations in various parts of the country as demonstration projects for renewable energy, and to increase public awareness and education on renewable energy, and then as well developing a feed-in tariff policy whereby residences can install renewable energy, PV or wind, which is feasible, and feed into the national grid, the national power grid, and therefore reduce their consumption from the grid, and therefore their corresponding electricity bills. Next slide, please. So this is empowering basically the consumer. Next slide, please. This shows global renewable energy uptake as it has done. We're seeing a shift going forward, and this basically looks at 4 different regions, just to give an idea. Next slide. I pass to Cindy now to speak to the just transition policy and why we're doing this. Cindy?
Thank you very much, Kishan. Good evening, everyone. I see very interesting questions being asked in the chat, so I'm not going to read these slides out for you, just give you some background on this concept of just transition. At the 24th Conference of Parties in Poland, the Silesia Declaration was adopted, which called for, it stressed the importance that of a paradigm shift towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient economies and societies that offer substantial opportunities for growth and development whilst ensuring a just transition of the workforce. It takes into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce to include the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined priorities. It also speaks to equitable access to sustainable development and eradication of poverty. It seeks to ensure that the benefits of a green transition are shared equally across all populations and segments of society. Various international organizations and frameworks such as the UNFCCC, the UN SDGs, and the International Trade Union Confederation have adopted the principles of just transition, and I'm sure by now other agencies have gotten on board with this concept that is working in tandem with a lot of what Kishan described earlier in his presentation as it relates to an energy transition to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Central to a just transition of the workforce is the importance of social dialogue, including all the partners in society, to promote employment, higher employment rates, adequate social protection, labor standards, and the well-being of workers. Cognizant of all of this, the Ministry of Planning, in collaboration with the Ministry of Labor, has sought to develop a just transition policy framework, and we've already done a number of consultations with stakeholders earlier this year. And this just transition policy that is being developed seeks to guide other policies nationally, so the overall policy framework, towards achieving the nation's goals of diversifying and transforming the economy. It includes considerations for decent work, gender equality, and support for vulnerable workers, etc. It is imperative for the country to identify opportunities for the creation of decent work in a low carbon transition. You can go to the next slide. The policy objectives are stated here, and in the interest of time, I won't really go into them. You can read. Most of this I would have covered already. In terms of the encouraging of investment in low carbon technologies, we have already done work to develop a technology action plan, and included in that would have been some consideration of the transition to the use of electric mobility, including what that might mean for infrastructural development and so on. So that work is being done. In terms of jobs, we've also started work to do an employment assessment for just transition in Trinidad and Tobago, where we will utilize quantitative and qualitative approaches and scenario development to develop a model using green job multipliers and employment data from countries that are comparable to Trinidad and Tobago to determine current and future labor market demand for workers in a transition to a greener economy in the electricity and road transport sectors. The reason being just the limitations of a particular consultancy, but with the intent to consider where the opportunities may lie as we move forward in this transition to low carbon and eventually to net zero emissions. I will stop there. I believe that is it in terms of slides, so that we can address some of your very interesting questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Cindy, and thanks, Kishan, for sharing with us. This is very, very interesting information for us at the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And as engineers and scientists working in the energy sector, we're really interested in this energy shift and how we can, use our skills and tools that we've developed in the energy sector and move forward for this shift. So yes, we have a number of questions. Of course, you can also raise your hand and ask live questions, but I'm going to take some from the chat. So I have one coming in from Chantal. Can you give any insight into current on-stream projects to switch the baseload power requirement of Trinidad and Tobago over to green energy, as well as the feasibility of waste valorization, possibly sagas and seaweed, for power generation, since Trinidad is heavily consumer type nation?
Okay, thank you. Yes, but I did make mention of the 112 megawatts solar utility scale solar plant that is to start construction, I think by next year, according to the Minister of Finance. That 112 megawatts would be the largest in the English-speaking Caribbean, if not the largest in the Caribbean region. So the transition to green power or green energy is already underway. There's also a policy statement to increase that complement of renewable energy from this present 112 representing 10% to 30% by 2030. So we can expect to see an increasing amount of penetration of green energy. In terms of waste valorization, I am not sure if there are studies to do that. I know there has been, for example, a waste to energy study, and there have been some overtures to look at the feasibility of waste to energy generation that would also simultaneously address the waste waste generation issue. But I'm not sure where that is at the moment.
Yeah, I believe there's some work at UE. So Sasha, yes.
Oh, thanks so much, Kishan. We actually have, and Cindy, we actually have a number of questions. So I'm trying to kind of collate all related to the NDCs. There's a question from Kerry-Ann Ferreira on whether any of the current NDC targets have been met so far. And then there's also another question on the previous NDCs were heavily focused on mitigation, and because of this, we're moving towards more updated and more ambitious NDCs. When is this updated NDC projected to be submitted, and will there be an increase in the number of sectors included in this updated NDC, and will that also include adaptation?
Okay, thank you for the question. In terms of the NDC targets, we don't have a previous NDC. We have a current NDC, which is what obtains to be achieved by 2030. So that the achievement of that NDC is still in progress. The utilities scale solar power generation is one part of it. The electric vehicles penetration is another part of it. And as well, energy efficiency and energy conservation aspects in terms of policies also being formulated for implementation. So it's a work in progress, and only in 2030 would we be able to, when we assess the tracking of the NDC, would be able to say whether those targets have been met, or whether even earlier whether we are on track to meeting those targets. Just remember that we have to separate the Trinidad and Tobago target from the global target. We're just contributing to the achievement of the global target. In terms of the updated NDC, we are in the process of finalizing that to go to cabinet, and hopefully we can make an announcement at COP26 on that. Adaptation for the moment is not included in the NDC unless it contains a mitigation co-benefit, because the spirit of the NDC, and that's for two reasons. The spirit of the NDC is for mitigation and reducing emissions. And if there are adaptation measures that have reduced emissions reductions co-benefits, then they will be included. But more than that, because adaptation is a long-term goal for impacts that will manifest itself over decades, it will be difficult to account for an adaptation goal by 2030, because measuring it and accounting for it would be highly difficult or challenging, if not downright impossible. My personal opinion is that it's just not possible to do that. So adaptation, the answer is no, adaptation is not included. Other sectors are being contemplated, certainly the cooling sector to address the fluorinated gases, because they too are greenhouse gases, ozone depleting substances. So the long and the short is that at the end of the day, we will have a more ambitious NDC than is currently on the table.
Yeah, Cindy and Kishan. So there are a lot of questions about the NDCs continuing, and there's some in the chat they are saying, like, someone is saying that we were meeting the NDCs, and then somebody's asking, are we really currently meeting it, and what's the plan to go forward? There's also a relevant question of what impact it had on our nationally determined contribution since the closure of the refinery at Petrotrin. And I guess just add to that, how are we going to go forward? There's questions on that, like how are we going to go forward and ask at COP26? I know you guys are going to be the representatives. So, how was the plan forward in terms of measuring the NDCs and tracking it? Are we meeting it now? And what's our plans to go forward to meet it, if not?
Right, thank you. That will be largely facilitated through the MRV system, monitoring, reporting, measurement, reporting, and verification system. If once it becomes a law that would mandate emitting entities to report on their emissions, I can't say how the closure of the refinery has impacted, because coincidentally, our most previous, most immediate past, most up-to-date greenhouse gas inventory only took into consideration data from up to 2018. So in our next cycling of inventorying, we'll probably see how that impacted, because in the previous trend analysis from 2006 to 2018, we did actually see the impacts of the closure of some of the industries, such as iron and steel, for example. So in the next cycling, we'll see how that manifests itself. Going forward, again, is a transition, and it's a great challenge for Trinidad and Tobago being a fossil fuel economy. But again, this is a global effort, and things would have to be put in place through policies and so on to develop greener technologies, to develop greener industries that are sustainable. Because there are countries in the world that survive without a drop of oil or a molecule of gas, and they do perhaps do better than us. I would prefer. So oil and gas is not, having no oil or having no gas or transitioning to green economy is not a doomsday scenario. In fact, if we continue with oil and gas and fossil fuel world economy, that is a doomsday projection based on the available science.
Thanks for that, Kishan. And I just want to, this Q&A session is very, very interesting. And I just want to ask the audience if they could give us about 5 to 10 minutes extra, just to see if we could get through some more questions. And I actually have one related to this energy transition from the audience. And it's about, do you think yesterday's budget presentation puts us on track to achieve an energy transition by 2030, as stipulated in the our NDCs?
Yes, bearing in mind that one of the sectors that we have targeted in the NDCs is transportation, and we have the policy objective is sustainable transport, which would probably be energy, electric vehicles charged with renewable energy, solar energy. So you have absolute emissions-free transport, both from the tailpipe as well as from the charging source. This is a significant step in the removal of taxes. Will now make electric vehicles, or in terms of cost parity, more competitive, or at least competitive as existing internal combustion engines. The market forces, of course, will determine how that evolves, but the operating cost of an electric vehicle is much less than an internal combustion engine vehicle, because you don't have to buy oil, you don't have to buy gas, you don't have to change transmission oil. All you have to do is recharge your batteries going forward. The challenge would be on how we now develop the infrastructure that may have to respond to any increased demand for electric vehicles in light of the budget provisions. But I think we have enough experience from the CNG switching program to learn from in terms of how to manage that transition.
Yeah. And Kishan, leading on to that, there's a question actually: is carbon taxation considered as an option to control, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Trinidad? I know in London and stuff, there are charges, like if you go into some parts of the city with your car and that kind of thing. I know you said about putting stations around the savannah. So how are we going to go? I myself have a hybrid. I see it have different categories of EVs and one, and we have a CNG in there. How do you transition? You guys are the Ministry of Planning. How we plan to move, like we have a hybrid, and then you have the electrical with gas and electrical, and you have the pure electrical, and then you have CNG inside of there as well. So how is that? Do you have a planned strategy? How are we going to happen?
Yeah, well, like I said, the objective is to go to sustainable transport. You correctly said that a hybrid car is also an internal combustion engine, so you still depend on liquid fossil fuels for its mobility. How it evolves, again, it's likely that market forces will drive it, depending on consumer behavior. But now it's open-ended. New car dealers, foreign used car dealers, can bring in EVs at competitive costs. I think what is now missing.
Since I see I hear from your tour, I'm wondering if you.
What is now missing is the education and awareness of consumers, as with everything else, in terms of the benefits, because they still look at the electric vehicle as something, space technology that is out there. That my little chug diesel engine is what I will depend on for life. So that transition again will depend on consumer behavior, consumer demand. and market forces going forward. But the policy objective is sustainable transport in line with the stated NDC commitments and of course the wider Paris Agreement objectives.
Oh, thanks so much for that. And I guess this one will come. It's from me, and it's on financing because climate finance is my interest. And is Trinidad and Tobago considering more innovative financing mechanisms? Debt for climate swaps, payment for ecosystem services, also more blended finance options for financing this energy transition.
Yeah, well, the financial investment plan speaks to some blended options. We spoke about the public-private partnerships that can work, where you have more private sector investment with their recognition that the transition also affects them. The debt for climate swaps is something that is broader in terms of an approach, which we are now advocating regionally. Because it requires some thought and it requires some although I know Seychelles, for example, have also explored that option. It will also require a feasibility study in terms of how much bang you get for the buck. But just to say that we are in the middle of developing a carbon pricing mechanism for Trinidad and Tobago, recommendations for a carbon pricing mechanism. We are undertaking that with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. And hopefully that will give us some idea of how these innovative approaches. Well, it's not innovative. This is being done in other countries with good success. So how it can work for a small economy, I guess, is what would probably have to be taken into account. Bearing in mind, economies of scale, but also taking into consideration that we have a fairly high level of greenhouse gas emissions in Trinidad on a regional basis and on a per capita basis as well. I think yesterday we were number 2 in the world.
All right. Thanks for that answer, Kishan, and thanks, Kishan and Cindy, for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I myself, wrapping up on finance, I mean, one thing that people kind of forget about like the Paris Agreement and going through to COP26 is that the commitment really is for developed nations who have a lot of wealth accumulated over time to help developing nations and to make financing available. And I know you guys are going to be going forward to represent Trinidad, a small team. So I wish you guys the best of luck in us getting financing as engineers, scientists. You was talking about innovation, green innovation, green engineering. And I mean, in Trinidad, we have Shell, BP, the big players, BHP. If through them as well, we get more funding available for green innovation challenges, green energy challenges that young people, people at UE, the UE chapter is part of us, with SP, TT, UE chapter, UTT chapter, for them to, to be inspired and have like some grants and prizes so that we can make the shift faster as well. So, I hope for Trinidad and Tobago, we have some luck at COP26 with that effort. Thanks for taking the time. I know it's really busy for you guys to be on here. Thanks for my co-moderator, Sasha, SPTT, Susan, SP Gaia for this great initiative. Cesar Pinto, everyone who has helped make this SP Gaia effort going. The SP Gaia TT chapter, all my other committee subcommittee members, Gail Ramdat, Cavell, and Miguel for putting together this admin and this presentation, and everyone for joining us on afternoon, late after work. So we will be sending the presentation to you guys by email and answering all the questions in the chat that were not answered. We will get the answers back to you guys. So I hope you guys have a lovely evening, and thanks from everyone for joining.
Thank you for having us. Always a pleasure. I could speak on this for weeks. The time is always too short, but my pleasure all the same. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kishan and Cindy, and thank you all, the audience, for attending and sharing your thoughts and questions on this very, very interesting and pertinent topic. So looking forward to meeting you all again at future SP Gaia TT Talks. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.